Today. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Creating a Communication Coaching Structure and Support for Your CRP Program. I'm Nicole, a Continuing Education Coordinator for the Collaborative for Accountability Improvement. So please feel free to submit questions into the chat or the Q&A function throughout the session. I'll keep an eye on them and we will address all questions during the final 10 to 15 minutes of today's presentation. So now I would like to introduce today's speaker, Melinda Niel. So Melinda has been working to help resolve adverse events through communication, apology, and resolution care for 10 years. She's the Director of Care Programs at the Betsy Lehman Center for Patient Safety in Massachusetts, formerly known as MACRME, leading its implementation team. And she consults on care implementation for institutions across the country. In the past, she has worked as the manager of patient safety at Beth Israel Deacon's Medical Center in the Department of Healthcare Quality, where she helped build one of the first care programs in the state and was a contributor and advisor to AHRQ's Candor Toolkit. Welcome, Melinda. I'm pass things over to you for today's presentation.
Great, thanks so much, Nicole, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm just going to share my slides. Okay, let's get those up. Okay, can everybody see those? Hopefully, yes. Just chat in if you're having trouble.
Looks good.
All right, perfect. All right, well, thanks for joining us today. And I know that those of you that are on the line probably know already a lot about CRPs or care programs in Massachusetts. That's what we call them, communication, apology, and resolution. So if you hear me saying care, I really mean CRP. So we're all very familiar with what those programs are, but today we're going to talk a little bit about how to really build a robust coaching program for those kinds of communications that you need to have in CRPs. And our objectives today will be to describe the benefits of communication coaching in CRP programs and to be able to summarize the structures necessary to support the successful communications after adverse events occur. So you've probably heard this a number of times in your life, but in this kind of a program, this is really true. Communication is key. And in CRPs, really 80% of what we do is communication, and we need to pay attention to communication at all times, but especially from the beginning. So we know, of course, as patients ourselves, and also from studies that have been done, that patients always want to be heard and informed about their healthcare. But it is especially true when something unexpected happens, whether that's a complication that was not preventable or an actual error. It's a time when we need to get better at our communication. And CRPs, as I said, are 80% communication, but that is good communication that needs to happen from the start. If it doesn't, it puts you on sort of shaky ground for the rest of your CRP process because you want to be able to build a good relationship, and good communication helps to do that. What is good communication? In our case, we have 3 components that we want to be part of all communications in CRPs, but especially that first, what we might call a disclosure communication. We want honesty and transparency in that conversation, along with empathy and support for the patients. And if we have to talk about all the facts that we know, not anything that we might surmise or don't know, but think might happen, because that could set us up for poor communication and trust in the future. So when we are training folks on how to do this, these are the components that we want to make sure are happening, that it's good communication across those channels. Not just, that something happened and we just want to get it done and tell you that we're disclosing. And that's sort of why we moved away from the term, what used to be disclosure, apology, and offer in these programs, because it's not about just disclosing something. It's about a process of communication that the patients can talk with you, but also that you're offering them a number of things like we're showing them here: empathy and support, honesty and transparency, and the facts that you know at the time. What we do know is that that kind of communication is hard. CRP events are rare and high stakes, which means that even though providers know that they happen and may have been involved in a few, it doesn't mean that they are practiced at it. They are conversations that can be very difficult, and though they may have learned about them, just-in-time coaching is a tool that we use to help those providers to do the right thing at that time and not have to remember all of the very difficult and key steps in what a communication after an adverse event looks like. Because of that, you need to have those resources available. just in time. And that's something we'll talk about, how to set up that structure so that when something goes wrong, they know how to access those resources and that they feel comfortable doing so. Another piece of this is broad education around what to do after an adverse event and how to communicate. So while just-in-time coaching is extremely important, you also in a CRP will want to do a lot of broad education to the general clinician and provider population to say, this is why we're doing this program, and these are the things you need to know about communication after an adverse event so that if it happens to you, you'll know what to do. And like I said, there are lots of different individual small components that happen in the conversations, but we want everyone to know that the resources are available. So we'll talk a little bit about what to set up in terms of a broad educational structure as well, so that those resources can be used when we want them to be. Good communication is also necessary to the success of a CRP program in each individual CRP case. So the first reason is to build trust. You want to be truthful and honest and transparent from the beginning, because that means that you are taking this patient seriously and that you know that something has gone wrong and that they will need support, and you want to figure out how you can best support them, while also telling them what you know. And one of the things we like to say is that being supportive and truthful also includes acknowledging that you might not know all the answers right now, but that you will find out and you will get to the bottom of this. And I think one of the most important components to demonstrate in that good communication is to demonstrate that you are taking that event seriously. You may not know exactly what happened, or you may think you do know exactly what happened, but in order for you to show that you're taking that event seriously, you will tell them, we are going to do an event review where we look deep into the root causes of this. And it's a prerequisite to preventing this from happening again, right? Because we know that patients care about making sure that this is prevented in the future. And so in that communication, it's really important to emphasize that piece as well. And finally, because it's hard to get the toothpaste back in the tube. If you disclose or communicate to a patient that something happened because of this reason, and then once you've done the root cause analysis, it wasn't because of that reason, it's very hard to back that up and keep the trust and good relationship that you are trying to build in a CRP. And that is one of the reasons why just-in-time coaching is so important, because often in these situations where providers are in a spot where they're not used to having to have these conversations or don't really know what to anticipate, they may say some things that they feel like make sense at the time, but then they actually weren't right. And so that's why the coaching is so important, and it helps to build that relationship of trust. So of course, there needs to be communication training, and we're going to talk mostly in this presentation about how to set up the coaching structure, but you will need to train your coaches, of course. There are basic components of disclosure communication, and there are lots of training programs around the country that can do this if that's something that you need or feel like you need a refresher on. But all of your coaches will need to be coached to these principles. So every time they're having these conversations after adverse events, you want to show empathy, and true, real empathy, facts as they are known at the time, a promise to look into what has happened and follow up with more information on the results of that process. Offer of support with internal resources. This is really important component of this initial communication, that acknowledging that the patient and family have experienced something that was completely unexpected and that they probably need kinds of support that you can offer, and also things you may not have thought of. And so you need to have built into that conversation, asking about what they may need. You hopefully will have some internal resources that you can help connect these coaches and these those that are doing communications with, but also you may have some external resources. I know in Massachusetts, we have the Betsy Lehman Center, which has a whole department dedicated to trying to help support those that have gone under adverse events, and connect them with others who have done the same. And that's sort of a really helpful resource. So there may be other things in areas where you live that you can connect them with as well. So that's part of that communication. And finally, documentation of the conversation. We'll talk a little bit about how we, at some of the sites that we work at, tell folks to document that. But that's an important piece, is that once you've had the conversation, you also need to have them document it. And the rest of the training should certainly involve role playing in practice. I do know a lot of great resources that list the things that you're supposed to do, but really most providers say practicing actually being in these conversations is what helps them to get better at it. So thinking about how you structure a coaching core team. Most of the sites that I work with do their centralized coaching for just-in-time coaching from the risk or safety department. These would be folks that are extensively trained with simulation. They've attended and participated in many disclosure communications over their career, and coaching is really part of their job description. They are the people that we want providers to pick up the phone and call, page, ask about, because they have a lot of experience with disclosure conversations, but also with CRPs now. And so usually this is the team that is overseeing the entire CRP process. So you certainly want to build at least a few coaches in that department that can help at any time. Other sites also add clinicians to this roster of a coaching core team. So what they often do will find clinicians that folks will go to naturally. So nurse managers or chiefs or other individuals that people will gravitate toward when something has gone wrong in their environment. And that has been very helpful because, depending on what your structure is at your organization, having someone on the floor or in the office there with them can help to make sure that they get that coaching right when they need it. At a minimum, those kinds of clinician coaches should understand where to get the coaching assistance if they need it from risk or safety, and then how to offer that basic assistance after an adverse event themselves. And then finally, part of that core team should be patient relations and social work. So patient relations and social work are a really important part of how we connect with patients and families. Lots of times risk and safety will be looking at an RCA, trying to do the root cause analysis and event review to say what really happened here, was this preventable, how could we prevent it in the future? They are an important part of a CRP, but are often not the folks communicating with patients. And clinicians, again, are talking a lot about the care that has happened and what will be maybe the sequela or the different things that that patient needs to do about their own medical care after the event. But they are not the point person that patient or family can reach out to at any time with questions, concerns, support that they might need. So it's really important to have the patient relations and social work or social work team as part of what happens when there is an initial communication after an adverse event. So what we typically do is we work with these members of this department because they work with patients daily who've experienced challenges. That's part of their job and their experience. And they will end up being that point person for patients and families in many conversations. So often we actually will send a patient relations person to this initial disclosure with the clinician to have the conversation and say, I am your point person. I will help you get your answers to your questions. If you need anything, talk to me. So involving them as the core team from the beginning is very helpful in focusing everything on supporting and communicating with the patient in the way that you want throughout the CRP process. So there are some other things to think about. Of course, some structural considerations. So your volume, how many beds do you have? How many number of events do you have reported annually? And the number of FTEs that you have to be able to do this kind of just-in-time coaching. So this coaching model can be flexible based on this. So for some folks, they really only have 1 or 2 people that work in risk. They can't be answering a pager 24/7. They need to have a team more spread out. So those kinds of facilities often will very heavily train chiefs, nurse managers, and other clinicians in the departments. So that while risk is an important core element, they may, actually spread that out a little bit more. And you also want to think, how many calls do you think we'll be getting about this kind of coaching? You want to look at your events that are reported annually and say, this is how many we usually get, but we're hoping to get more calls because we want to make sure that people are calling us before they have these initial communications. So let's take a look at our events and see how many we'll think we'll get and make sure there's enough support for that. You also want to think about, are there different mediums that you could use to do this just-in-time coaching? So, a few years ago, we used to do a lot of this coaching in person. Someone from risk would, come down to the floor and talk to them about what they can expect from the patient and what kinds of things they should say and how they should help support them. Now we can do those in a lot of different ways. And so, there's Zoom, there's a phone call, there's, they can come down in person, and there are all these different ways that you can support them, but you also want to make sure they know this, right? Because I think a lot of times they're thinking, well, I'm not going to call because I got to do this right now. And if I don't do it right now, there's going to be some consequences that I'm worried about. But phone, Zoom, all available. So if those are things that you have available to you to use, you definitely want to emphasize that providers can reach you in those ways. And then you also want to think about the hours needed. If you are, level 1 trauma center, you probably need 24/7 access to coaches. If you are an ambulatory center, you probably don't. You may have different needs, and you may be able to use your daytime FTEs to cover a pager line or something like that. And I'll talk in a little bit about how you can set up the different structures based on that. But these are just other things that you want to think about when building your system. So this is a suggested structure of what a core team would look like in terms of coaching for after adverse events. A lot of the facilities I work with have a model that looks like this. It doesn't have to, as I said, look exactly like this, but all those elements need to be present and available to patients when something has gone wrong, and to providers when they're going to have these conversations. So at the top here, we just have a central team of 2 or more, depending on the size of your facility, coaches in risk and safety that are available by phone or pager during business hours, and patient relations available to dispatch directly for conversations. Usually in facilities now, there are people that know to call risk and safety anytime something happens, but what we want to do is send that message that there are supports available to you in these kinds of conversations at all times. You can pick up the phone, you can page them. So that's during business hours. Then a lot of times folks will have administrators on call, also trained in basic communication principles, and then will connect immediately to that central team in risk safety if it's after hours. And so, an administrator will say, okay, you're going to have this conversation. These are the things that I know from my training. Let me also connect you back to the central team, so that if for some reason the central team is not available because it's midnight and someone's on vacation or whatever, the administrators on call at least have some basic training and comfort, and they're a little comfortable talking about what needs to be in these conversations. And then they have that other second level of support as well that's hopefully available. Same on the other side, leader clinicians in departments are available for on-scene for coaching and support, and then they can also connect to the central team. So there are many ways to do this, but I do know that from experience coaching lots of different sites, that central team in risk safety being those expert coaches that can then reach out to all of the different arms that you may build is really essential to making that successful and having that available all the time. So then there are a few things that you want to think about after the coaching, and that these need to be part of sort of the structure of what is set up in these conversations and after the conversation. So you have your initial coaching with the providers, and then you want to make sure, they're going to have that conversation with patient relations, maybe in there. If they're not, you want to activate that at least afterwards. So if that patient needs support from social work, they need a connection, and the patient relations person was not available at that time, because maybe it was after hours, you want to make sure that that's something that you put in place right after this conversation, so that it's not sort of lost to follow up, right? So that the provider had that conversation, that's great, but you didn't make that connection for support. You also want to make sure that you have activated your peer support program, if you have one. Hopefully in a CRP, that's something that you're either building or already had, but this is a great time to say, okay, now that I've gotten that phone call that we need to coach about a disclosure conversation, now I need to activate peer support, like that this might be a situation in which we might need to use this. So that's a good way to use that as a flag. And then in your patient safety reporting system, it's also really helpful. I know a lot of folks have, in their RL or whatever they use, when someone goes to report an event, it will say communication, has this event been disclosed to the patient, yes or no? There's also a little box next to it that says, call this pager number. This is a coach for just-in-time coaching. So that it sort of triggers in their mind, oh, I need to have this conversation around this event, and there's a resource for me. On the flip side, you may get patient safety reports and risk for safety and say, like this case, it doesn't say that it's been communicated. I'm going to reach out to them and make sure that we do this conversation right. On the flip side, again, you want to make sure there's a patient safety report about whatever you were coaching about. Sometimes that also happens. So these are a few things that we sort of have as a checklist when we get called for an initial coaching. did these things happen after that? So that can be part of that structure. So good communication is hard, as I said before. Now we're going to talk about the broad educational piece. So we talked about how you can build that structure on the back end in risk and safety, how to spread that out to the clinicians that are on the front line, and how to make sure that everyone is connected and able to help just in time. But you also want to have a broad educational structure underneath that as well, so that they're going to reach out when you want them to. So when we do this, we have 3 things that we want all providers to know. Who are the communication coaches? How do I access them quickly? And what are some basics about communication after adverse events that I should know? So these are literally slides that I took from an educational module that we use for our clinicians, our frontline clinicians. So they know when there is an adverse event, they need to report the event and get help with communication. We have a paging system at a lot of our facilities. You can also, as I said, use the reporting system where there's like a little number that says, call this number. They know to call risk management, or they each have a patient safety coordinator in the department. They know how to call them. But we want to make sure that they know, okay, you need to report it and you need to get help. Here's your pager number. Here's the person you call. Step 2, communicate with the patient and family about the event, be empathetic, and use statements of regret. So we sort of give them these general principles. I'm so sorry this happened to you. And we give them a little bit of a education on apology. Some of them are still a little nervous about saying they're sorry. But we say, a statement of regret, I'm so sorry this happened to you, is always appropriate. And then we may apologize with, what we call an apology of fault once the facts are known. And if it really truly is our fault, that is exactly appropriate to do. And so we talk a little bit about that. And then we emphasize with them they need to document the communication with the patient and family in the record. And that includes the facts of what happened to the patient, the clinical results, who was present in the conversation, and the results of that conversation. And then the 4th step for them is to check back in with the patient and family and see how they're doing, and if they've connected to any resources or if they need anything. So, later they may be part of a resolution conversation, and that's important too, but we want all providers to know that these are the expectations after an adverse event. However, we don't expect them to remember all of this, because we know that, as I said before, it's a rare event, and we want them to be able to just know how to get to resources. So what we do, I'm going to skip to this slide for a second. What we do use are a bunch of different kinds of resources that will help them to do that. So this is an example of a badge card that's used at a facility. One side has, this is my pager number that I need to call if there's an adverse event, on hours, off hours, and a little bit of advice about what an adverse event is and how to communicate about it, so that they have some of those basic sort of triggers. Oh yes, I learned about this. These are some of the main principles, and I should call this number, and it's always with them. There also, other sites have used posters that they can put in break rooms that just have, like, if you've had an adverse event with the patient, page this number, call this number, and that will just be up and available on the wall. A lot of other folks put things on their intranet system, so they might have a patient safety page, or where people go to report into their patient safety system, they will have the pager number very clear. And then again, like I said, there's sometimes a note in the patient safety reporting system when someone goes to report, it says, hey, have you talked to someone about this communication? If not, coaching is available to you. We also have a lot of other educational options to tell the providers this kind of coaching is available. Grand rounds, of course, and that's a great way also to do an introduction to what a CRP is and why you're using it. But as I said, the main thing we try to tell them is, make sure if something happens, call us, because we have the support to help you in these conversations. We also have departmental presentations, and this may sound silly, but literally make a spreadsheet of every single department that is in your facility and make sure that you have gone to each of them. It's funny how there are, in lots of facilities, certain departments that everyone goes to and talks to because maybe they're more like front patient facing, but it really is important that every department knows about this, including pathology, radiology, and those that may not be speaking directly to the patients all the time. They still need to know that this is available, because they may be brought in to a conversation, and it's important that they also know that it's there to support them. So we actually we made a spreadsheet, and then we did a sort of recurring meetings. And so every time, once a year or every 18 months, we'd say, we haven't been there in a while. Let's go and remind them that this resource is available and why we do it. And that this is a really important thing for our hospital and that we are there to support them. Nurse managers and floor meetings, those are other excellent places to go to make sure they know about the resources. And of course, resident and new hire training. Like you can make that part of your virtual training that you have, or if you have that in person, just give them their badge card and tell them that this is what to do when there is an adverse event. So there are lots of other resources for clinicians to educate clinicians about how to have these kinds of conversations on the Macrame website, which is now part of the Betsy Lehman Center. So these are the kinds of things that once you have the structure in place, like there are plenty of resources to help you get the information out to places. So that's it. And I hope that helped really helped you understand sort of what a structure could look like to support these kinds of conversations. But I'd love to open it up to questions or any comments that anyone else has, or if anyone else has any experience with a coaching support program, we'd love to hear it from you too.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Melinda. And please feel free, everyone, to submit your questions into the chat or the Q&A. I'll give everyone a moment to do that. And we did have a question that came in from Lisa about documenting the initial conversation, and some of this you answered, but I thought maybe you could talk a little bit more about the documentation process. Lisa asked, how do providers document this in the medical record? Are there detailed notes, such as who disclosed to, what was disclosed, what the patient and family response was, or is it something much more simple? So maybe you can explain that in a little more detail and kind of talk about how you encourage this documentation to take place.
Sure. Yeah, definitely, Lisa. This is a great question because I think it's something that a lot of people are a little bit anxious around too. The incident disclosed to patient and family note is something we see a lot, but we would prefer that it was better and more descriptive than that. We do advise that they say who was there in the meeting, because I think that what we're trying to do in this record is to say this is part of their care, and part of their all aspects of their health care should be documented in the record, and us discussing what has happened and what we're going to do about it is really part of their care. And so we do say who has been there, who was there at the meeting, what was discussed, obviously briefly, but the facts that you were able to tell them and that you would get back to them. I would say patient response sometimes is documented. I think that's sort of half and half. I've seen that documented, sort of more like patient and family understands and we will follow up with them or something like that. I would be hesitant, of course, to say, like, you don't want to say like patient and family were like very angry or something like that. Although I have seen that as well, but I think that would probably be like a little more discouraged, I think, from the documentation standpoint. But I think saying like making sure that they understood, or that they may have questions later and that you are open to talking to them about it or things like that. But yes, we do like it to be a little more descriptive. Things that we say not to put in there, like I talked to risk management before having this conversation and they told me to say this, like those kinds of things we would not want them to document in the record, because that's not really part of their care. It's more of like the process that the clinician has had beforehand. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. Let's see. Our next question comes from Asher. And what are the main reasons some programs don't succeed? What is most critical for them to work?
Coaching programs. So I'm going to assume you mean coaching programs, although I could certainly talk about CRPs in general. But I think for coaching programs, a lot of times it's about the knowledge that they exist and what they're going to provide for them. If that is not able to be communicated to frontline clinicians, they often won't use it. And I will say that when we first developed this kind of program, we put that pager out there and it was almost never used. But what we found was that they were contacting risk in a different way, or through the clinicians on the floor. And then their nurse managers would know to talk to patient safety. So what we ended up doing was we used our patient safety coordinators they would go to different departments, different M&Ms that were specifically in these departments, and they got to know people. And then they said, we are coaches for these kinds of events and they're really hard conversations. Please reach out to us. And we found that way was more natural for them to do that. And so that the calls directly to risk ended up being better than the pager. But it will be different based on your organization. But I think sort of making sure that they know it's available and then sort of following their lead about how they can best reach you, it will probably make that the most successful.
We have another question from Claire. Do you have any good video tools you use with providers for just-in-time reminders of the basics of CRP in addition to your one-on-one coaching?
Well, we do have, I wish I could remember. iPath is the app that a lot of people use in terms of like re-upping education. So we do use those. They're like slides that they need to interact with. I would say those are a little bit effective, but to be honest with you, I think a lot of the technology that we use is not great for reminding them sort of how to do this. We really just want to get out there that they should call these coaches. And so sometimes we've used like backgrounds of screen reminders, like when they come into the computer terminal, it will say like, if you need help after an adverse event, call this number. But I would say like, we don't rely really heavily on technology, but that is a good thing to consider. So.
We have another question. Do you have any advice on the characteristics of who should or should not be part of this communication coaching team?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I don't think it should be an enormous group. As I said before, it's a skill set that takes a lot of practice, and it is something that is high stakes. So you want to certainly have somebody that is comfortable having these kinds of conversations with patients themselves, I think, because you're going to want them to be able to describe what this is going to be like for those providers that are going to go in and do this. They also sometimes will go in a conversation as well if it's, a resident or something like that, and they happen to be the only attending around, or you want somebody that has done a lot of these and feels very comfortable doing them themselves. I would also say you certainly want someone that folks already gravitate toward if you're going to use the clinician model, because you want to use a person that they already trust, because this is such a high stakes event. People that I would say you would not want to use, obviously those who don't have a great, like what we might call bedside manner, or maybe would give advice that like wouldn't be empathetic or something. But I think that you probably wouldn't spend a lot of time, like I think it would be very quickly sort of self-selecting that those people probably wouldn't want to really be coaches for this kind of program, because when they're getting trained, they will be trained in, how to express empathy, how to leave silence, how to make sure that you're leaving your body language open for questions, all of those kinds of things. And so that I feel like that's probably a pretty self-selecting group to say, like if people aren't going to want to sit in front of people because they don't like have the time to talk to patients, then they probably wouldn't want to be one of these coaches. But I will say you would probably want to keep the real true coaches a small and manageable group while broadly educating others. So.
We have another comment that I'm hoping you can reflect on, and it says that documentation seems to be more of a defense strategy in case a claim is made rather than needed for patient care. And I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Sure. So I will say generally documentation has been seen in that way for a long time, right? Like, so the reason why I'm documenting this is so that I don't get sued, which is like just not the reason we should have records, right? Records really truly should be about making sure that we're documenting what is happening with that patient's care. I think in this specific case, the reason why they want to document all that information is because they want to make sure that we are acknowledging that this is part of us taking care of the patient, and that we had this conversation, and that we are trying to be accountable to getting back to the patient about it. So it's not only us saying, these people were there, we did this, check the box. We're not trying to check the box. I think what we're trying to say is we had this conversation, which requires a follow-up and requires more things to be done. And so let's make sure everybody knows who has been in this conversation, what has been communicated so far, so that we know here's what we've done and here's what else we need to do. And that's hopefully what most medical records are, right? Like, this is what we've done so far, this is what we need to still take care of. And that's the way I think they're thinking about it. I do see how that might be interpreted, like if you're putting who was in the room and what exactly did we say, that we're trying to sort of cover ourselves. But I think the opposite is actually true. Like what we're trying to do is say, we still have we did what we were supposed to be doing in a CRP, which is making sure we're communicating with the patient about an adverse event, but then also saying we have more to do here. And so this is in the record so that it's a trigger to say there's more. We need to follow up. This is a piece that is part of their care, just like we need to follow up on this test, or we need to make sure we check that before they're discharged. So.
Let's see, we have one additional question. Do you have any strategies for getting senior leadership on board with like allocation of FTE and staff towards establishing these programs? And anything that you can share?
Sure. I mean, I think more broadly, just we're establishing a CRP program. This is a necessary component of that. I do know that it is difficult in some circumstances to convince CEOs that even patient safety and risk trying to implement something like this is worth the investment. I think there are a few strategies that folks have used. One is going directly to boards. So boards often feel like this is something that makes sense. They probably thought this was already happening, and they are, they're very supportive of this. So talking, having a presentation to a board about like why this is important and what the value is to the facility is sometimes helpful. And then the CEO is like, oh, okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. Like we can get on board here. I think making a cost case is very useful, but it's a little bit hard. And there's some studies being done now, but it's a little hard to put a number value on what kind of advantage programs like this offer, because preventing events from happening is hard to quantify sometimes. And that is a big component of CRPs is, yes, we want to make sure that we are communicating with patients, supporting them, and compensating them when needed and when we should, but also that this doesn't happen again. And if we are transparent about this, like that will prevent that in the future. And so, but making a cost case for that is effective, I think, with CEOs, but it's a little hard to do that unless you're sort of tracking that in your own facility. The third thing I would say is that a lot of folks have really been saying, this is a department that needs to scale up as other things scale up. So, if your hospital is acquiring other hospitals or new ambulatory sites, or, like a lot of places are these days, sometimes the risk and patient safety departments are not scaled up in the same way because the CEO or the others in the executive office don't really understand the functions that are required and how many more cases they will get when that happens. And so making a real case to them about, this is going to increase our volume if we don't have enough coaches available, if we don't have the wherewithal to be able to analyze these cases and do root cause analysis, this is going to keep happening and it's going to make for an unsafe environment. And so those are some of the strategies I've seen, but I feel your pain. I do understand that that's hard.
Hey, do we have any final questions? I think we've gone through all the questions in the Q&A and the chat, so I'll give everyone a second to come up with any final questions, and if not, we will close for the day.
I see there's a comment here that says Florida is required to disclose, the disclosure is documented. That's actually true in Massachusetts and probably in a lot of other places too. And I think that is for a reason, to make sure that they're actually disclosing, because there is a statutory requirement that they must disclose all medical errors. And that's why I think when we are saying what should be documented in the record, we want to go beyond just saying this was disclosed. Like we want to make sure that it's talking about the whole process so that we can follow up on that.
All right, well, I don't think we have any more questions for the day. Melinda, thank you so much for sharing with our community today. And you can see her email down below if you have any questions. And of course, you're welcome to reach out to the collaborative for anything. So thank you so much, everyone. And we hope to see you next month. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye.